The Canadian Arctic is one of the most difficult environments to survive in. The people who have made it their home have a determination and resourcefulness that helps them persevere despite incredible difficulties. But sometimes it's the people, not the harsh terrain and climate, that prove to be the deadliest force in the northern frontier. In 1921, a series of events unfolded that resulted in the deaths of 8 people, which put a new spotlight on the territories and opened a new chapter in Canadian criminal justice. Royal Canadian Mounted Police, originally the Northwest Mounted Police, expanded its duties from Western Canada into the Yukon in the 1880s as trading posts and gold seekers began to enter the area in large numbers, and in 1895 the first police outpost was established. As the number of American whalers, traders, and gold rushers rose, the need for police to protect Canadian interests increased as well. In 1903, the Northwest Mounted Police's jurisdiction grew further to encompass Herschel Island, which became the northernmost RCMP post and the sub-district headquarters overseeing all of the Western Arctic. Within less than 2 decades, the presence of Northwest Mounted Police, now the Royal Canadian Mounted Police after merging with the Dominion Police in 1920, grew to 25 detachments of over 70 men in the Arctic frontier. One of these men was William Andrew Doak. He was born on August 4th, 1883 in Fredericton, New Brunswick. He came from a large family, being the sixth of 9 children. Joining the army as a bugler at age 17, he served for 2 years from 1900 to 1902 before being honorably discharged after the completion of his service. In June of 1905, he joined the then Northwest Mounted Police and would serve for years in western provinces before transferring up to the territories. On May 1st, 1920, he was promoted from constable to corporal. He would make his way up to the detachment in Tree River in the Northwest Territory, which is where he would be in 1921. Detachment at Tree River consisted of 4 officers: Corporal Doak, Constable Stevenson, Constable Bonchar, and Constable Woolham. Cyril Uwingnek held the position of Special Constable, given to local Inuit who worked with the RCMP as guides and interpreters, who would also stay at the detachment sometimes. The difficulties of officers in the north extended beyond the immediate duties of keeping order among the population. They, like everyone else living in the region, had to work to stay alive and well. Their remote dispatches could be far from another village or extra help, sometimes hundreds of miles. Travel was only possible by dog sled, which is how officers were able to reach remote communities, and it was dog sled patrols that the RCMP used to monitor the vast northern frontier. Being the only federal employees in the region also meant that in addition to law enforcement, constables' duties sometimes included things like delivering mail. It could take days of travel to reach a destination. Reaching somewhere to investigate criminal activity could be an arduous trip on its own. The Tree River Detachment itself was about 3 to 4 days' ride from the next nearest RCMP detachment. Officers maintained their cabins, clothing, and equipment, hunted for food and wood, provided food and care for sled dogs, and maintained contact with locals, trappers, and fur traders to stay aware of what was happening in the area. It would be months or up to a year between shipments of supplies, and news was often slow to reach the furthest outposts. Visitors and connections with the outside were always welcome, such as when Wilhelmer Stevenson from the American Geographical Society passed through Herschel Island where Doak and the other officers were stationed. He later wrote to the RCMP to get their current postings so that he could send them some books to help pass the time. In June 1921, on the Kent Peninsula, a dispute broke out between members of a Copper Inuit community that would spiral into tragedy. There lived a man named Iki Algagnia, whose wife left him. Iki Algagnia's father, Ikpukawak, and his cousin Hanak wanted to find a new wife for him, and so shot another tribesman, Analgviak, in order to take his wife. This quickly dominoed into further violence. When Hanak returned to his tent, Tatamagana, another man and hunting partner of the wounded Analgviak, was there and shot Hanak dead with his rifle. Pugnana, a cousin of Hanak, saw Ikialgagnia run for his rifle and shot him dead. Ikpukamak, father of Itialgagnia, seeing his son dead, fired several shots at Pugnana, but did not hit him, whereupon Pugnana fired back, killing Ilpukawak, in addition to shooting Hanak's wife. With both Hanak and his wife dead, the final victim was their 4-year-old daughter, Okolatina. The tribe, as they would later describe, did not want to be burdened with her, and so killed her as well. Infanticide took place in Inuit communities during times of hardship and privation when caring for a child did not seem feasible. 5 people had quickly lost their lives, with the 2 surviving men, Pugnana and Tatamagana, now unsure of what their fate would be. The men continued to live among the small Inuit camp made up of 4 families, but tension continued to grow. Over the next few months after the killings, Pugnana began carrying a loaded rifle with him wherever he went. Tatamagana, who was also Pugnana's nephew, and a young man named Alakomiak began to become fearful of Pugnana. At the eventual trial, Alakomiak stated, "After the killing, he was angry with the people all the time," and added, "He was angry with them. He was cranky." When asked if Pugnana was dangerous, Alakomiak replied, "Yes." Tatamagana and Alakomiak said that they and others had grown afraid of Pugnana. While fishing together one day, Alakomiak first suggested to Tatamagana that they should kill Pugnana. He agreed and they came up with a plan. In September, the 2 asked Pugnana to go squirrel hunting with them, and the 3 set out together. While walking, Tatamagana walked on Pugnana's left side, and Alakomiak followed a short distance behind. As they had planned, during their walk, Tatamagana turned to Alakomiak and signaled to him with his eyes. Alakomiak raised his rifle, loaded with a .30 shell given to him by Tatamagana, and fired at Pugnana, sending the bullet through his back and out his chest. Pugnana fell down, took a few short breaths, and died. The 2 remaining men covered his body and returned to the camp, telling the others that Pugnana was out deer hunting. Their fellow Inuit soon found out what had happened, though, and went to find Pugnana's body, which they wrapped for proper customary burial. A 6th person had now been killed in 3 months, but unfortunately the final chapter in this tragedy hadn't been reached yet. Word of the murders traveled through the local populations and made it to the RCMP detachment at Tree River. On December 3, 1921, Doak, Constable Willems, and Cyril set out with 2 teams of 11 dogs each and went to the Kent Peninsula to investigate. After visiting several Inuit villages and interviewing locals, they began to track Alakomiak and Tatamagana. Tatamagana was found and arrested in a local village, and they learned that Alakomiak had gone further inland. Corporal Doak traveled for several days and finally found and arrested Alakomiak. Returning to Tree River, he learned of another Inuit man who was wanted for murdering his partner and had to detour to arrest him as well. The police now had 3 prisoners and several witnesses in their party. Doak sent 2 of them to be held at a nearby area called the Seal Camp, 7 miles away, and continued on to Tree River Post with Alakomiak, whose feet were freezing. Doak treated the man's partially frostbitten feet at the post by warming them with his hands and lighting the heater at the center of the post barracks where they slept. While in custody at Tree River, Doak had Alakomiak assist him in the daily chores to help maintain the outpost. The 2 got along, and by Alakomiak's own admission, he was treated well. But, while repairing a pair of boots, Alakomiak would become upset when Doak told him that he hadn't done it properly. The next day, on the morning of April 1st, Alakomiak chose to put a grave plan into action. He awoke, and as the sun was beginning to set, he went out to the storeroom and found a rifle and shells. He returned to the detachment building. Constable Stevens and Bonashore were at the seal camp hunting for seal meat, which formed a large portion of their winter meals, and Constable Woolham was sent to get the winter's mail. Alakomiak and Doak were alone. With a loaded rifle, Alakomiak approached the sleeping Doak and fired. The bullet entered Doak's upper thigh and passed through the center of his body. He rolled over and tried to speak. His mouth filled with blood as he was bleeding profusely from the wound in his lower body. According to some newspaper reports published after, Doak bled out for 2 hours before dying. According to Dr. Philip Doyle, who did not treat Doak at the time but tried to form his best opinion of the circumstances and paint a picture at the trial later, Doak likely would have died in an hour at most. Alakomiak's testimony seems to imply that Doak died quickly, perhaps after a mercifully short period of time. After shooting Doak, Alakomiak watched out the detachment window. The RCMP buildings were across from a post of the Hudson's Bay Company, and its employee, Otto Binder, came by the police detachment daily. Knowing this, Alakomiak watched from the window of the police barracks, and when Binder was about 50 feet away, Alakomiak aimed and fired his rifle again, killing him instantly with a bullet through his heart. He then went over to the Hudson's Bay Company post where Binder had worked and lived. An Inuit woman named Toktogan, who also lived at the HBC cabin with her 2 children, had seen Binder fall from the porch. Alakomiak approached and found her crying, and told her that he had killed Doak and Binder. He told her, "Don't cry anymore. I can't help it." He then asked her to help carry Binder's body back to the RCMP barracks and placed it near Doak's. Alakomiak wanted to wait for the other RCMP constables to return, and later said, "I intended to wait and kill them when they return from the sealing camp." By this time, Toktogan had notified a couple of other Inuit men of what Alakomiak had done, and they talked him out of any more killing. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Cyril was able to get word of the murder back to the SEAL camp where Constable Willem was, and he arrested Alakomiak. In a twist that brought the tragedy full circle, Toktogan had been the wife of Ikialgagnia. She left to work for Otto Binder to earn money on her own. It had been the end of this relationship that sparked the slaughter on Kent in the first place. Contrary to what some reports, and even the initial statements at the eventual murder trial said, Binder was not married to Toktogan, at least not legally. Her 2 children that were living with her were also not his. It's not completely clear what the extent of their relationship was, and Toktogan lived and worked as a housekeeper in his cabin as part of the Hudson's Bay Company post at Tree River. A Constable Myhill from Fort McPherson was the first to be able to bring down word from further up north and telegram the head office with news of Doak and Binder's murders. It was late July as news of the events at Tree River began to finally trickle down into the rest of Canada, and the first reports began to appear in papers. The first write-up about the story, reprinted all over Canada and the United States, contained several notable errors, as initial reports often do, especially with a large gap in time and distance from the events in such a remote locale. It claimed that the young Inuit, unnamed in the article but implied to be Alakomiak, had murdered the 5 people on his own, when in fact they were the result of a multi-person shootout. The murder of the 5 Inuit also did not occur while they were sleeping, or in the month of March. It also misspelled the name of Corporal Doak as Boak, which would cause further confusion later, and referred to Otto Binder as E. Binder. It was also said that the Inuit man made a dramatic threat to wipe out the rest of the island, when no such statement had ever been made by Alakomiak. The delayed pace of the news had several knock-on effects as it reached south. Doak had listed his mother as his next of kin, though she had died recently, the previous May, and the RCMP had not yet updated their contact information, which further delayed them in informing Doak's family of his death. They looked to their files to find the addresses of his siblings in order to reach out to them, but news of the murders in the north was already arriving in newspapers. In addition, Corporal Doak's bank account had received his pay for the months of April, May, and June to the amount of $225, which meant that his overpayment would have to be refunded by his estate. Descriptions of Doak, praising him for his kindness and dedication, appeared both in papers and internal RCMP dispatches. Corporal Doak was considered one of our most experienced northern men and a man of excellent conduct. His sad death is very much regretted by the whole force. He was a man of the most kindly disposition, liked by native and trader alike, and a friend to all men. On July 22nd, Doak's brother, a Mr. Allison John Doak, wrote to the RCMP commanding officer in Regina, concerned that the recent press reports may be referring to his brother.
Dear Sirs, the press is giving an account of a member of your service, Constable Boak, being killed at the Herschel Islands by an Eskimo. Will you kindly advise me if you have had any information, and if it is really Constable Boak, or would it refer to my brother, Corporal W.A. Doak, who left the island some months ago to go further north on special duty? Should you have no word, would you kindly advise me if there is a Constable Boak in the force at that post as soon as convenient? Yours sincerely, Allison J. Doak.
Confirmation arrived to the RCMP by telegram 3 days later, with condolences to Doak's family. The RCMP head office would reply back that news of Corporal Doak's death was regrettably true. After hearing back, Alison Doak wrote to RCMP headquarters in Ottawa on the same day, July 25th.
Dear Sirs, will you kindly give me what information you have regarding the death of my brother, Corporal W.A. Doak, who was killed at Tree River last April? Major Jennings of Edmonton wired me that information, but further to that I have only had the press dispatches to depend on. From the press, it would appear that the department did not have the current addresses of his relatives. Our mother, whose address you appear to have as Fredericton, New Brunswick, moved to Winnipeg, where she died last year. There are several other members of the family, but I understand none of them have had any direct information. I would like to know just how he was killed and where his remains are at present, or where they are to be placed. In fact, any information that I can get would be greatly appreciated by myself and the other members of the family. Thanking you in advance, I am yours truly, Alison J. Doak, Brandon, Manitoba.
Feeling stirred by the murders of Doak and Binder, in addition to growing concerns over the lack of Canadian law being administered in the northern frontier, especially in relation to murder among the Inuit, resulted in the Government of Canada deciding to take a firmer stand regarding justice in the north. A special judicial envoy would travel up to Herschel Island and hold court. 5 Inuit would face trial for murder on Herschel Island, but the cases of Alakomiak and Tatamagana were the two that people were the most interested in. Previous sentences of convicted Inuit had seen them sent to penitentiaries. Several years prior, 2 Inuit were convicted of murdering 2 priests and were sentenced to time in prison, but it proved ineffective as they found the guaranteed meals and warmth of prison preferable to the difficulties of living in the Arctic. Judge Lucien Dubuc from Edmonton was chosen as the trial judge. It would be the first trial of Canadian law in the Arctic Circle. The attorney for the defense would be T. L. Corey, and the Crown was represented by Irving B. Howitt. Inspector S. T. Woods, the senior officer of the Northern District of the Northwest Territory, who had been Doak's commanding officer, would also be present as a witness. Sergeant F. E. Spriggs and Constable M. F. Greville traveled as RCMP escort, and Constable Richard S. Wild was the stenographer. The RCMP barracks on Herschel Island, being the only federal building in the area, would be used as the makeshift court. The Judicial Party left Edmonton by train on June 12, 1923, and headed up to northern Alberta to the town of Waterways, now part of Fort McMurray, where they would travel the rest of the way by river. The final portion of the journey was by the HBC schooner Reykjavik, which took them to Herschel Island, the frontier of Canadian justice. 1 month after departing, they arrived on Herschel Island on July 12th. For the first Canadian court case held in the area around the Polar Sea, the trial jury was composed of 10 men, trappers, traders, prospectors, and captains of ships, some of whom were married to Inuit women. They were from Norman, Aklavik, Good Hope, and Herschel Island itself. In the meantime, a couple of months before, in May of 1923, a request was made from Divisional Command in Edmonton to the RCMP Commissioner in Ottawa, requesting funds to pay the Edmonton Granite, Marble and Stone Company in order to provide a headstone for Corporal Doak at a cost of $85. There was also a stated intention to disinter Doak's body from Tree River for reburial at Herschel Island, but the ship they attempted to contract for it was unable to properly store a body for the duration of a trip, and so it was decided to keep Doak's grave at Tree River. Newspapers followed and reported on the case, often focusing on strange and lurid details. Public interest ranged from disgust to dark fascination as they read about concepts like shared partners and infanticide among the Inuit. They came to know that a very complicated domestic dispute among several Inuit families had resulted in multiple slayings on Kent Peninsula, which eventually spiraled into the murder of an RCMP officer and a Hudson's Bay trader in the remote north. Towards the end of a lengthy article detailing the murders and the proceedings of the trial, a writer for a Kingston newspaper brusquely summarized things as, "Evidence revolved around the eternal triangle, which in this instance was so complicated as to render it almost unintelligible to the average white man. Wives had been shared, exchanged, and passed from hand to hand in the most carefree manner, but ultimately at the fishing ground, a free-for-all tribal war resulted in which most of the natives took sides and killed one another until the casualties narrowed down the combatants to 2 or 3. He continued later, "At this time, the survivors of the war were breathing their last. Women were lying on the ground stabbed to death. Men were dying from gunshot wounds, and all around the camping place on the bleak shoreline were scenes of the most revolting description." Papers often reported on how youthful Alakomiak looked, and how at ease he seemed with his situation. His age became a point of discussion and contention, as there was concern that he might be too young to face the death penalty. Internal memos from the government discussed the matter, as did the press. Inuit means of measuring age at the time did not tend to focus on calendar years, and it was estimated that he was about 20 years old. While on the stand, he stated, "I do not know how old I am. I hunted for the first time 2 years ago this winter, and could not hunt before because I had no rifle or bow." The trial dealt with 4 charges of murder. Both Alakomiak and Tatamagana were each charged with killing Pugnana, and Alakomiak had the 2 additional charges for the murders of Binder and Doak. Both men would also be witnesses in each other's cases. Taking place over 2 days, on July 17th and 18th, 1923, the trial was straightforward and concise. Neither man challenged the accusations made against them and readily admitted to the charges. The jury returned verdicts of guilty for all 4 charges of murder, with a strong recommendation for mercy in the murder of Pugnana, as the jury felt it was right that they had feared for their lives. After taking a few weeks to deliberate, Judge Dubuque sentenced both men on August 11th to death by hanging, and set December 7th as the date for the executions to be carried out. The hangings would take place on Herschel Island with the intent that it would send a message about Crown justice to the Inuit in the Northern Territories. In October, now Corporal Bonshore returned south, bringing Corporal Doak's effects with him. Many items, including his uniform hat, belt, and some equipment, were sent to his siblings, who had requested them as mementos of their deceased brother. Corporal Doak's estate went to his sister, Hazel Doak of Winnipeg. Delays pushed the execution back 2 months from December 7th, 1923 to February 1st, 1924. That night, ropes were swung around the tie beam in the rafters of the ominously named Bone House, an old outbuilding that used to belong to a whaling company and had been bought by the RCMP shortly after the turn of the century to be used for storage. The 2 Inuit men were led to their makeshift gallows and hanged until they were dead. In the fall of 1924, the headstone for Corporal Doak arrived in Tree River on the Hudson's Bay schooner Fort McPherson, which had come up the Mackenzie River to finally mark the resting place 2.5 years after his death. In 1926, a passing member of the RCMP found that the headstone had fallen over in the wind, the monument being tall and narrow, and the base of sand and wood having quickly deteriorated in the difficult climate. The headstone was reset and cement was poured to form a more secure base. Soon, Otto Binder II was given a granite headstone, and both graves were enclosed with a small wooden fence. By the late 1920s, the RCMP no longer kept a permanent barracks at Tree River, but patrols and other detachments in the north still passed through there, and they would report on the conditions of Corporal Doak's grave. RCMP patrols and Mr. F.R. Ross, manager of the Hudson's Bay post at Tree River, would make frequent inspection of the graves, keeping them clean and free of debris. Mr. Ross resodded the area with fresh grass, and members of the force would pull weeds, cut the grass, remove stones, and repaint the fence whenever they were in the area. Another of Doak's brothers, P.W. Doak, would stay in correspondence with the RCMP over the years in regards to their late brother, and would share information with the family. In 1942, an issue of the RCMP's quarterly magazine mentioned the incident, and in 1944, a memorial window at the RCMP chapel in Regina was installed, commemorating the deaths of members of the force while in service, including Corporal Doak. 1951 saw the CBC's Heroes of the North radio program cover Doak's story in an episode, and in 1963, an island in the Canadian Arctic was named for the late corporal. As the fur trade slowed down and more locals moved to Inuvik and the Mackenzie Delta, the need for the Herschel Island detachment, the most northern post in RCMP history, gradually diminished. Officers made occasional patrols of a largely uninhabited island. The post maintained a purpose, though. From the 1940s to the 1960s, it was the home of the RCMP's sled dog breeding and raising program, using 2 old buildings that were joined together, which are still preserved today. In 1963, the beam used to hang Alacomiac and Tatamagana was removed from the bonehouse, burned, and replaced. And in 1964, the RCMP closed the Herschel Island post for good. As time progressed and members of Doak's immediate family passed away, he faded from living memory. In the same year, the Herschel Island detachment was shuttered. 1964, final correspondence was added to Doak's record from a nephew looking for information about his late uncle. After that, his file passed to the dormant records section. The story of the tragic events that unfolded over the first few years of the 1920s, memorialized by two lonely graves near the cold waters of the far north.